to welcome everybody on a beautiful fall day in Bloomington. I'm not sure what the weather is like at your end, but here it's a beautiful fall day. I'm Aurelian Craiuțu, for those of you who haven't met, I haven't met yet. And with Les Lenkowski, we have a little program called the Tocqueville program that hosts talks and events over the academic year. This year we are confined to Zoom meetings. This is actually an idea that Les and I have had to discuss the idea of America over this year, academic year. And this is the first talk in a series of talks that we'll be organizing on rethinking about what America means and meant and should mean in the future. So Brad Wilson, who is the executive director of the James Madison Program in American Ideals and Institutions and faculty fellow at Butler College at Princeton University, has kindly agreed to be our first speaker today. He will be talking about his two-volume edition, basically, of Alexander Hamilton's political writings that he co-authored with Carson Holloway for Cambridge University Press a year ago. Brad will be speaking for about 30 minutes or so. And then we invited one of our ABDs, Matthew Lucky, who is completing a dissertation in our department, to give a response on Hamilton. What we want to figure out is, why this interest in Hamilton today, and whether we should pay more attention to Hamilton's political writings in many ways. But I do think there is a background to the whole discussion, which is not about only the American soul, which is so much discussed today, but it's also about the importance of executive power in modern society in general, but also in America today. So for all of these reasons, I would like to reiterate the importance of rethinking Hamilton's role in the political tradition. One final thought I would like to add to my short presentation, which is Hamilton played an important role in the political thought of Vincent Ostrom, who is one of the founding fathers of the Ostrom workshop. I've always wondered why Hamilton, not Madison, was the preferred thinker for Vincent. But Vincent stood with three major influences. One was Hobbes, the other one was Hamilton, and the Federalist Papers broadly. But Hamilton was his favorite one, and of course Tocqueville. So it was a strange combination of influences that had an impact on Vincent Ostrom thought. So it's for that reason, additionally, that I'm particularly grateful for Brad for accepting to talk to us about Hamilton. So without further ado, we'll give you a virtual applause for now, but a real one at the end. So Brad, your turn. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Aurelian. Am I visible to all of you? I'm not to myself, so.
Yes.
Okay. Well, thank you, Aurelian, and thanks to the Tocqueville program, which I believe you founded, for inviting me to this conversation. And I must say, it's an honor to be affiliated in any way, shape, or form with the Ostrom Workshop. Vincent and Lynn Ostrom are legendary in the field of political economy, which is a field that Hamilton knew quite a lot about. I can understand why Vincent was so interested in Hamilton. So I thank the workshop for having me. Let me set the mood with a quotation, certainly applicable to Hamilton's life. You'll know this, its applicability just by having watched the musical. It's from an early 19th century book review by the Scottish historian and polymath Thomas Carlyle. And here's the quote: "No man lives without jostling and being jostled. In all ways, he has to elbow himself through the world, giving and receiving offense. To paint a man's life is to present these things," end quote. My own field is devoted primarily to political thought. The thought of a statesman is different from that of the best known political philosophers, as it's produced and honed in response to the crush of human events and is aimed at political action. Let me begin with a few remarks about the two-volume edition of the political writings of Hamilton that Carson Holloway and I assembled for Cambridge University Press. we tried to keep ourselves out of it as much as possible because we had a word limit and we were trying to cram as many of Hamilton's words into the 2 volumes as we possibly could, leaving our own words out. We led with, well, I should mention that Carson and I are editors-in-chief of a new series with Cambridge titled The Political Writings of American Statesmen. So we led with the Hamilton volumes and are now preparing a 2-volume edition of the political writings of George Washington. We're also rounding up editors for editions of the writings of other American statesmen. These are not easy projects. Just to speak of the Hamilton project, the authoritative edition of the papers of Alexander Hamilton, published by Columbia University, comprises 27 volumes plus 5 volumes of the papers of Hamilton's law practice. How to reduce this volume of writing to 2 books, to 2 volumes with a word limit provided by the publisher, that was the challenge. Hamilton himself was our guide. He rarely addressed an issue that came to his attention without relating it to some enduring aspect of human nature, some fundamental political principle, some axiom or maxim of conduct, even as he also reminded his readers of the role of prudence in statesmanship by emphasizing that such principles and maxims often admitted of exceptions in particular circumstances. We read his massive output with a view to including all that is of enduring political interest, but only what is of enduring political interest. Our primary principle of selection was to include whatever touches on matters of principle, political, philosophic, legal, and constitutional, and its application to political practice. Needless to say, we failed miserably given our word limit and the extent of the materials we reviewed. To mention only one omission, we did not include any of the 51 Federalist essays written by Hamilton. There are many available and affordable editions of the Federalist Papers, including one with Cambridge, so we thought we could safely leave that out. How would history have been different if the orphaned Hamilton had left his home in the Danish West Indies for, say, London or Paris, rather than to the American colonies? We can't really know, of course, though we can certainly speculate that given his exceedingly humble origins, a marginal character in a world in which mobility between social classes in the old world was infrequent, the ambitious young Hamilton chose the right destination for the unfolding of his talents, the relatively democratic world of America, characterized by what Tocqueville described as equality of condition. Hamilton lived to be 47 years old, or maybe 49, depending on whom we are to believe about that. I believe Hamilton knew his own age. He claimed he was 47 when he died. Contrast his rather brief life to that of other leading America's founders. Washington, 67, Franklin, 84, Jefferson, 83, Madison, 85, and Adams, 90. Yet Hamilton's intellectual and literary powers resulted in an astonishing quantity of significant and influential economic, legal, and political thought. There are his best known writings, especially the Federalist essays. In addition, the teenage Hamilton wrote influential pamphlets during the pre-revolutionary stage of the American colonists' conflict with the British government, hundreds of letters and reports drafted for General Washington during Hamilton's 4 years as Washington's aide-de-camp and secretary, and many series of essays addressing the fundamental political controversies of his time, all up to and into Thomas Jefferson's presidency, when Hamilton wrote 18 articles in 1801 and 1802, criticizing, under the pseudonym Lucius Crassus, the Jefferson administration's policies. But you sense the scope of his literary achievement. A year after Hamilton's arrival in the American colonies, my own university, Princeton, made perhaps the worst admissions decision in its history by turning down Hamilton's application. And so he enrolled in King's College, now Columbia University. I say perhaps the worst admissions decision, as I know a lot of disappointed parents of Princeton applicants who would beg to differ. Hamilton dropped out of college in 1775 to join a New York militia and to fight against the British in the American War for Independence. He was appointed in 1777 as an aide-de-camp to the great commander of the Continental Army, Washington, a position Hamilton did hold for 4 years. It was then that one of the greatest collaborations in the political history of the world, the partnership of Washington and Hamilton, was forged. Hamilton's storied political career effectively begins in 1782, after the wars concluded and his first of 8 children, Philip, was born. He threw himself into the study and practice of law, becoming the finest lawyer of his generation. From there, he became his generation's Forrest Gump, a leading participant seemingly in every historic turning point of the early republic. Hamilton is most remembered, perhaps, as the architect, as the first Secretary of the Treasury of the American system of public finance, which provided the monetary and fiscal structures and policies that serviced the debt accrued during the Revolution, restored American public credit, created the first national bank, established the US Mint, and much else besides. His report on public credit, his report advocating the chartering of a national bank, his opinion on the constitutionality of that bank, and his report on the subject of manufactures are among the greatest state papers ever written. It is in this period of Hamilton's public life, it is this period that leads to the rupture of his friendship with James Madison and his professional relationship with Thomas Jefferson, whom he didn't know as well as he knew Madison. Remember, while he and Madison were writing the Federalist Papers together, Washington was still in Paris. Indeed, that break of Hamilton's with Madison and Jefferson results in the emergence of America's two-party system, with the two parties, Hamilton's on the one hand and Jefferson's on the other, having as bitter and vituperative a mutual hostility as America's two parties today. Hamilton retired from the government in early 1795, but not before submitting massive new reports to Congress on his fiscal program and recommended plans for paying the national debt. As he exited government service, President Washington, as Hamilton exited, President Washington wrote him a letter that must have helped to salve the frazzled soul of a much vilified statesman. Quote, "In every relation which you have borne to me," Washington wrote, "I have found that my confidence in your talents, exertions, and integrity has been well placed," end quote. Hamilton remained the de facto leader of the Federalist Party throughout his years of retirement from the government, writing prolifically under pseudonyms and sometimes in his own name for the newspapers, and keeping up a constant correspondence with other Federalist Party leaders. He was essentially a fighting man with a tireless activity of mind. His last act as a statesman was in the election of 1800, when the House of Representatives deadlocked over the choice of Jefferson or Aaron Burr for the presidency. Hamilton persuaded Federalists inclined to vote for Burr to instead vote for Jefferson, whom it was obvious the people wished to be their president, thus giving the election to Jefferson. Needless to say, Aaron Burr never forgot that. As he wrote to his ally, Gouverneur Morris, during that contest, quote, "If there be a man in the world I ought to hate, it is Jefferson. With Burr, I have always been personally well, but the public good must be paramount to every private consideration," end quote. I'd like to devote the remainder of my remarks to what, in my view, are two of Hamilton's greatest and most enduring contributions to American political thought. Before doing so, however, let me try to sketch Hamilton's understanding of human nature. In one of his earliest writings, his admittedly interminable 1775 pamphlet, he was 18 years old, we can forgive his exuberance, The Farmer Refuted, signed A Sincere Friend of America, Hamilton wrote, "Political writers, say a celebrated author." Who is that author? David Hume, in his well-known essay that politics may be reduced to a science. Political writers have established it as a maxim, he's quoting Hume here, that in contriving any system of government and fixing the several checks and controls of the Constitution, every man ought to be supposed a knave and to have no other end in all his actions but private interest. By this interest, we must govern him, and by means of it, make him cooperate to public good, notwithstanding his insatiable avarice and ambition. Without this, we shall in vain boast of the advantage of any constitution, and shall find in the end that we have no security for our liberties and possessions except the goodwill of our rulers. That is, we should have no security at all. It is therefore a just political maxim that every man must be supposed a knave, end quote. Was this the early Hamilton to be superseded by a later Hamilton, the way some insist on reading Plato's dialogues? Well, here's a more mature Hamilton in 1787 in the Federalist Papers. After plenty of grown-up experience in the army at the virtuous Washington's side and in the political arena, quote, "A man must be far gone in utopian speculations who can seriously doubt that if these states should either be wholly disunited or only united in partial confederacies, the subdivisions into which they might be thrown would have frequent and violent contests with each other. To presume a want of motives for such contests as an argument against their existence would be to forget that men are ambitious, vindictive, and rapacious," end quote. Well, what about Hamilton by the end of his life, based on a wealth of experience and observation that eludes most of us? Here he writes to a political ally sometime after the ascendancy of his political rival, Thomas Jefferson, to the presidency. Quote, "Nothing is more fallacious than to expect to produce any valuable or permanent results in political projects by relying merely on the reason of men. Men are rather reasoning than reasonable animals, for the most part governed by the impulse of passion," end quote. He then accuses the victorious Jeffersonians of having successfully courted the, quote, "strongest and most active passion of the human heart, vanity," end quote. Why do I point to this aspect of Hamilton's thought? I believe it helps to explain both his emphasis on a stable, energetic, and competent national government and his dedication to what we might call, as he did, the spirit of enterprise. Indeed, these two commitments of Hamilton provide a useful contrast to the outlook of Jefferson, Hamilton's primary political adversary during their years together in the Washington administration and right up to Hamilton's death in 1804. Hamilton was a nationalist. I mean nationalist, not primarily in the sense that it's used today, as in championing the interests of one's own country and its residents before and even at the expense of the interests of other countries and their residents, though I do think his thought is fundamentally compatible with that perspective. I mean nationalist in the sense of continentalist, thinking in terms of the interests of the nation as a whole, as distinguished from the sometimes differing interests of its parts, the particular states that constitute the nation. As his biographer Henry Cabot Lodge wrote, "In a time when American nationality meant nothing, Hamilton alone grasped the great conception in all its fullness, and gave all he had of will and intellect to make its realization possible. He alone perceived the destiny which was in store for the Republic, end quote. The purpose of the national government, as Hamilton argued, purposes were to provide for the security of the fledgling nation, the advance of its prosperity, and to enhance its reputation among the nations of the world on which its independence and prosperity would ultimately depend. The fulfillment of these purposes, he argued, required a government that possessed energy and stability, dignity and public credit, the confidence of the American people, and the respect of other countries and their governments. And so Hamilton, in all of his work as a public man, sought to strengthen and broaden the general, by which he meant the national authority. And here we see develop a serious breach between Hamilton on the one side and Madison and Jefferson on the other, resulting in the rise of what all of the American founders denounced as most dangerous to a system of Republican ordered liberty, political parties, Hamilton's Federalists and Jefferson's Republicans. Why did the Jeffersonians choose the party label Republican, or sometimes Democrat? Because their intention was to persuade the public that Hamilton and the Federalist administration in which he served were in truth monarchists, intent on establishing dictatorial power, consolidating the Union by annihilating the states, and even attaching the country as a vassal state to its former master, Great Britain. Now, as wild as all of that sounds today, the campaign to paint the anti-slavery, orphaned immigrant, self-made man, Hamilton, as the anti-Republican, American elitist and Caesar, and the plantation slave master with the advantages of an aristocratic upbringing and education, Jefferson, as a man of the people and the apostle of democracy, was so successful as to lead Franklin Roosevelt to write that thanks to Jefferson's heroic efforts, the country was spared Hamilton's, quote, aristocracy of wealth and power, end quote. All honor to the Broadway musical, by the way, for rejecting that prevailing myth. It is true, however, that Jefferson had a much more modest understanding of the purposes and powers of the national government, and saw little or nothing to fear in the powers and ambitions of state politicians and state governments. Indeed, Hamilton correctly observed that for Jefferson, quote, state government and republicanism are convertible terms. Hamilton was the opposite, as he saw the real danger to be the, quote, subversion of the national authority by the preponderancy of the state governments, which of course was the experience under the Articles of Confederation. As for the Jeffersonians' accusation that he was unfriendly to republicanism, Hamilton declared, as to my own political creed, I give it to you with the utmost sincerity. I am affectionately attached to the Republican theory. I desire above all things to see the equality of political rights, exclusive of all hereditary distinctions, firmly established by a practical demonstration of its being consistent with the order and happiness of society. End quote. He wrote, the only enemy which republicanism has to fear in this country is in the spirit of faction and anarchy, end quote. Now, Jefferson disagreed. He said, I hold it that a little rebellion now and then is a good thing and is necessary in the political world as storms in the physical. Hamilton's and Jefferson's differences led to their first great clash in the Washington administration over the wisdom and constitutionality of the incorporation of a Bank of the United States as called for by Hamilton's plans to rescue the country's economy and its public finances from the desultory condition that in large part had led to the ratification of the Constitution of 1787. Hamilton freely admitted that his estimation of the threat posed to the Union from the ambitions of the various states within created in him a, quote, disposition toward a liberal construction of the powers of the national government, end quote. He famously argued in the Federalist Papers that the national government should be understood to have an unlimited authority as to, quote, all those objects which are entrusted to its management, end quote. And that the preservation of political and personal liberty would depend not on specified limits on federal power, but on the internal structure of the government and the dependence of the government on the people themselves. To the contrary, Jefferson insisted on the need for a Bill of Rights against governmental power, a sentiment that was strong enough in some states so as to give the Constitution its first 10 amendments. The other great point of difference between these rival founders has to do with political economy. Jefferson was an advocate of an agricultural republic where agrarian virtue, grounded in the rhythms of nature and in personal independence, provided the ethos of republicanism. In his notes on the state of Virginia, Jefferson wrote, "Those who labor in the earth are the chosen people of God, if ever he had a chosen people, whose breasts he has made his peculiar deposit for substantial and genuine virtue." Still Jefferson, the natural progress and consequence of the arts has sometimes perhaps been retarded by accidental circumstances, but generally speaking, the proportion which the aggregate of the other classes of citizens bears in any state to that of its husbandmen, its farmers, is the proportion of its unsound to its healthy parts, and is good enough barometer whereby to measure its degree of corruption, end quote. His view of the urban life, which he experienced for some years in Paris, quote, "When we get piled up upon one another in large cities, as in Europe, we shall become corrupt, as in Europe, and go to eating one another, as they do there," end quote. I think he was exaggerating. Jefferson saw the 1793 yellow fever pandemic in Philadelphia, which killed 10% of the population, as providential, his word. Providence's way of persuading Americans that the cities are pestilential in every way. As for commerce and manufacturing, Jefferson wrote, quote, "For the general operations of manufacture, let our workshops remain in Europe. It is better to carry provisions and materials to workmen there than bring them to the provisions and materials, and with them their manners and principles. The loss by the transportation of commodities across the Atlantic will be made up in happiness and permanence of government," end quote. We're reminded of Rousseau's discourse on the origin of inequality, his second discourse. In a letter of 1800, recommending a list of books to a young man, Jefferson includes the complete works of Rousseau, all 31 volumes, in French, he says. Rousseau wrote, quote, "Metallurgy and agriculture were the two arts that produced this great revolution." The revolution he's referring to is the division of labor. "They have civilized men and ruined the human race. Although men had previously been free and independent, we find him, so to speak, subject by virtue of a multitude of fresh needs to all of nature, and particularly to his fellow men, whose slave in a sense he becomes, even in becoming their master. Rich, he needs their services. Poor, he needs their help. And being midway between wealth and poverty does not put him in a position to get along without them. Finally, consuming ambition, the zeal for raising the relative level of his fortune, less out of real need than in order to put himself above others, inspires in all men a wicked tendency to harm one another," end quote. Rousseau's rejection of the bourgeois is striking. Behold, he's basically saying, behold the bourgeois man's narrow horizons, his cheap ambitions, enslaved to the wills and opinions of others, in the glittering misery of the city. With the exception of Rousseau's attack on agriculture, this is very much Jefferson's perspective on what today we call economic development. Let me briefly sketch Hamilton's alternative by way of beginning with a political problem identified by Aristotle in Book 4 of his Politics. Aristotle, in contrast to Rousseau, argued that the greatest good fortune of a polity is to be a middling or middle class regime. Why? Because the rich and the poor cannot have real affection for each other. The rich are filled with arrogance and contempt for the lower classes, the deplorables, and the poor are filled with envy and resentment of the rich. With each wishing to destroy the other, their city is terminally ill, unless a middle class can become the dominant political influence and the mediator between the other classes. But Aristotle has no proposal for creating a middle class. It is something to be prayed for, a great good fortune when it's found, but not the result of any statecraft to create the sort of middle class prosperity that would do the trick. Enter Hamilton. Federalist Essay number 12. Quote, "The prosperity of commerce is now perceived and acknowledged by all enlightened statesmen to be the most useful as well as the most productive source of national wealth, and has accordingly become a primary object of their political cares. By multiplying the means of gratification, by promoting the introduction and circulation of the precious metals, those darling objects of human avarice and enterprise, it serves to vivify and invigorate the channels of industry and to make them flow with greater activity and copiousness. The assiduous merchant, the laborious husbandman, the active mechanic, and the industrious manufacturer, all orders of men look forward with eager expectation and growing alacrity to this pleasing reward of their toils," end quote. You see how Hamilton takes his, shall we say, skeptical view, or he would say realistic view of human nature, and puts it to work. His 1791 report to Congress on the subject of manufactures is really his masterpiece of political economy. Unlike Jefferson, Hamilton welcomes and encourages governmental policies that promote American manufacturing. Quote, "The multiplication of manufactories not only furnishes a market for those articles which have been accustomed to be produced in abundance in a country, but it likewise creates a demand for such as were either unknown or produced in inconsiderable quantities." I guess that's supply side. "The bowels as well as the surface of the earth are ransacked for articles which were before neglected. Animals, plants, and minerals acquire a utility and value which were before unexplored," end quote. They're kind of shades of John Locke's second treatise in that. Admittedly, this all sounds very crass and environmentally exploitative. I mean, ransacking the bowels of the earth for minerals and so forth. So far removed from the virtuous agrarianism of Jefferson. But Hamilton had his mind set on every bit as liberal a project as Jefferson's. Not by any means hostile to agriculture, but he would argue more favorable to individual liberty and advancing human flourishing. How so? Hamilton says, quote, "By furnishing greater scope for the diversity of talents and dispositions which discriminate men from each other, it is a just observation that minds of the strongest and most active powers for their proper objects fall below mediocrity and labor without effect if they're confined to uncongenial pursuits." Not everybody wants to be a farmer. He didn't say that, but that's what I'm getting from it. And it is thence to be inferred that the results of human exertion may be immensely increased by diversifying its objects. When all the different kinds of industry obtain in a community, each individual can find his proper element and can call into activity the whole vigor of his nature. And the community is benefited by the services of its respective members in the manner in which each can serve it with most effect, end quote. A bit more, Hamilton. To cherish and stimulate the activity of the human mind by multiplying the objects of enterprise is not among the least considerable of the expedients by which the wealth of a nation may be promoted. Even things in themselves not positively advantageous sometimes become so by their tendency to provoke exertion. Every new scene which is open to the busy nature of man to rouse and exert itself is the addition of a new energy to the general stock of effort. The spirit of enterprise, useful and prolific as it is, must necessarily be contracted or expanded in proportion to the simplicity or variety of the occupations and productions which are to be found in a society. It may be less in a nation of mere cultivators, think Jefferson's farmers, than in a nation of cultivators and merchants, less in a nation of cultivators and merchants than in a nation of cultivators, artificers, and merchants, end quote. One of the most striking features of Hamilton's mind and character is his forward-looking nature. He predicted and was the chief architect of an American future now so familiar to us, the commercial and manufacturing industrious republic. As he saw it, it belonged to Americans to, quote, vindicate the honor of the human race, end quote. That all sounds terribly immodest, maybe arrogant, but Hamilton was nothing if not ambitious in the service of founding a government and with it a new nation. I'll close with Hamilton's torment late in his life, caused by the jostling and being jostled, remarked by Carlyle. In August of 1800, he writes to a friend, quote, "Never was there a more ungenerous persecution of any man than of myself. Not only the worst constructions are put upon my conduct as a public man, but it seems my birth is the subject of the most humiliating criticism. I am pained by the consciousness that it is not free from blemish." He's talking about his birth. Nonetheless, he continued, "the truth is that on the question of who my parents were, I have better pretensions than most of those who in this country plume themselves on ancestry." Finally, there is this lament in his letter to Gouverneur Morris in the middle of Jefferson's first term as president. Quote, "Mine is an odd destiny. Perhaps no man in the United States has sacrificed or done more for the present Constitution than myself. And contrary to all my anticipations of its fate, as you know, from the very beginning, I am still laboring to prop the frail and worthless fabric. Yet I have the murmurs of its friends, no less than the curses of its foes for my rewards. What can I do better than withdraw from the scene? Every day proves to me more and more that this American world was not made for me," end quote. If you add to this his fatal duel with the country's vice president, you have what amounts to Shakespearean tragedy. Thanks very much.
Thank you, Brad. I would like to invite Matt Lucky, our ABD, to give a response, and then we'll take questions for this excellent presentation. Thank you, Matt.
All right. Thank you, Professor Wilson, for your presentation, and also thank you for your work on the 2 volumes from Hamilton. It's been exploring through those, and it seems like a nice resource for anyone already familiar with the landscape of American political thought, looking to venture deeper into the weeds. I think I'm going to try and pick up roughly where you left off, thinking about Hamilton's legacy going forwards and how he kind of fits over time in the American political mind. Specifically on this, I tend to think of this in reference to Machiavelli's observation in the Discourses that one of the strengths of republics is the depth and breadth of the bench of characters that they can draw on at any time, based on challenges that Fortuna applies to them. And I think the America is beneficial specifically because the founding gives this large ensemble cast of different characters that you've been presenting for us, especially with Hamilton, where at different times, meeting different challenges, we can look to different political figures. One result of this, though, is that Hamilton's specific cocktail of political principles has not always fit the moment. I'm thinking here specifically, you alluded to his skepticism of human nature, some elitist tendencies, preference for energetic government, a loose construction of the Constitution, militarism and national defense, specifically support for markets, financial industries, and in particular manufacturing. Immediately following his death, his legacy is left basically an environment of Jeffersonian democracy, which isn't especially kind to it. Though in the long run, Hamilton does have the revival. In particular, in the second half of the 20th century, he provides a useful foil as someone supporting, flourishing and human growth and economic liberty, to contrast with our Cold War adversaries. Likewise, at the height of the Industrial Revolution, his prescient vision is remarked upon. In particular, for instance, NYU names him as their first inductee to the Hall of Fame of American Heroes as the father of American capitalism. In a slightly different spirit, Teddy Roosevelt, with his preference again for energetic government, praises Hamilton specifically for his character having a touch of the purple, as a favorable reference to the Roman Empire. Though in the long run, there's also been points where Hamilton has been ill-suited to the national mood, especially so during the Great Depression. His association with the financial industry and specifically federal government not necessarily doing everything that it can to help out earned him disapprobation. FDR, in particular, cast adversaries as the Hamiltons among us opposed to recovery, though there is a hint of irony in that, since FDR's, again, energetic and loose construction of the Constitution makes him perhaps one of the better exemplars of Hamilton's legacy in the long run, if turned to different ends. So one thing that I'd like to call on you to kind of offer your thoughts on is, you've already spoken of his legacy promoting nationalism and the growth of American manufacturing, though what elements of Hamilton's thought aren't suited to the current moment? We're in a period of economic crises, compounding with political crises and health crises. So what in that mix of elitism, skepticism of human nature, energetic government, and promotion of capitalist economics is ill-suited to the moment? Second point that I'd like to raise, it's a little bit more narrow, though I'd like to push you a bit on the characterization of Hamilton as an economic nationalist. Specifically, I'm thinking of, and this might be a small issue, but the program that he has for discrimination of Revolutionary War debt, which, just for the audience, one of the questions that Hamilton has to address as Treasury Secretary is retiring the existing national debt, most of it accumulated during the Revolution, and often because of the lack of faith in the confederal and continental congresses as forms of government, that the actual debt was worth very little or trading very poorly on the markets, which meant that it had mostly been acquired by financial speculators. Hamilton takes the expedient choice, specifically to not discriminate against who is holding the debt at the moment, rather than trying to track down the original soldiers in the army, specifically just saying whoever has it at the moment, they ought to be the ones paid. This is framed, at least in part, as a defense of private property by him. And also, again, it's simply the expedient decision. Though it does mean that people that fought for the nation and bled for it are not compensated, while financial speculators and coastal elites are. And this gets compounded because of the funding system for the debt, partly in imposts, but also his like infamous whiskey tax is interpreted at the moment as a mechanism of redistributing wealth from farmers and from the interior and the West, again, to wealthy coastal elites. So when we're framing Hamilton as an economic nationalist, I'd like to push back on that a little bit because many of his programs, if we're counting coppers in the moment, tend to have a more immediate factional effect rather than a pure like national bounty. One other point I'd like to call for your comment on is thinking of Hamilton in the vein of the politics of expertise. Like currently this year, we've gotten a good education of the trouble that encounters when technocratic experts, specifically public health officials dealing with COVID, also have to interface with a skeptical public. Both in Hamilton's time and ours, that's compounded by a highly fractured, both through the media and epistemically and over partisan lines public, that is going to have trouble with receptivity to the guidance of experts, whether it be helping them on mask mandates or setting up a national bank. So I'd like to inquire on your thoughts about how well Hamilton kind of manages that role over time, and what advice, specifically his politics as an expert in finance, helps us to understand like politics of the public relating to expertise more generally. And I think with that, I'm going to leave off. Thank you again for your presentation. I really appreciated that. And I'm happy also to thank you to the Tocqueville program for giving me a chance to talk.
Thank you, Matt. What I'd like to do is to invite you to raise your hand. I will have a chance to see who rose their hands. And I'd like to invite two people at a time to put questions. But before we do so, I'd like to give a chance to Brad to comment on Matt's observations briefly. So feel free to raise your hand in the chat, and I will try to invite two people at a time. Brad.
I'll try to be brief. Why don't I first take up the question of discrimination with respect to paying off the debt. This is quite interesting. Matt, I don't know if you had a chance to look at Hamilton's letter to Edward Carrington from 1792, I believe. And there Hamilton says that Madison was in agreement with him, and then switched horses and astounded Hamilton by going into opposition on the discrimination plan, not to discriminate. And so that's all very interesting because it leads Hamilton to say of Madison that I thought he was simple, candid, straightforward person. And now I think his character is of a peculiarly artificial kind, and I don't think that's a compliment. Hamilton himself, everybody said that his fault was not his artificial character. It was that he said whatever he believed in every circumstance, and sometimes that was very imprudent. It got him into all kinds of fights that he could have avoided. So I think the political context is complicated there. Hamilton says that, yes, he ended up, at first he tried to figure out how he could accommodate the new Madison, but then when he started working the numbers and seeing how complicated it would all be to kind of discriminate between people who originally held the debt and those who hold it now because it was sold to them, he says it's just so complicated. He has no idea how such a plan would work. So that's the expediency part of it. The principal part of it is Hamilton's devotion to sanctity of contract. You make an agreement with somebody to give him a piece of paper and he pays you something for it, you've made a deal. And that has to be honored by any government that is looking towards building a system of stable property and, public credit. So I think he has both things going, expediency and a kind of moral case rooted in his notion of simply keeping one's promises. And he does say that we can't know whether the soldier who sold his continental currency to a speculator didn't turn around and invest that currency in something else that got him a lot more money than he otherwise would have gotten by holding on to the. You'd have to go around individual to individual and see what happened. And that's where he says it's just an impossible task. All that is not to say that there weren't speculators. There were, and Hamilton acknowledges their existence, and he thinks it's simply unavoidable in at least the system that he's trying to create. There will be speculation. The question of expertise is an interesting one too. Matt, thanks for raising it. We know that Hamilton wished for expertise in governance. And that's why he thought he was the right person to become Secretary of the Treasury, for example. He had already done a lot of work on that subject. Reading, Aurelian's favorite writers like Necker, people like that. So he and when he talks about judges in Federalist 78, right? It's going to be the rare citizen who's qualified to be a federal judge, because it's going to require a degree of education, of training, of learning in the law, of working with precedents and applying in the new circumstances. That's a form of expertise. And he has his ideas about how to get those kinds of people into judgeships, but it's clear that he places a premium on what they know and what they're capable of doing. But when it comes to, the public health bureaucracy, I have no idea what Hamilton would think about that. It's too far away from his world to have public experts on health issues offering their opinion to the country as to what the proper way forward is. So my guess is that he would have his own opinions about those things, and he would be writing, pseudonymously for the newspapers, putting out his ideas to try to shape public opinion in the direction that he thinks is healthiest for the country, right? Hamilton must take the crown for having written the most, at least as a high statesman, having written the most for the public prince in order to shape public opinion. It's because of that, by the way, that I resist a little bit when people like my friend Steve Knott, who's written a lot of Hamilton, suggests that Hamilton didn't care about public opinion. Jefferson did, but not Hamilton. And you can't explain all that writing he did with that theory. He clearly understood public opinion to be at the root of the constitutional order. It had to have the confidence of the people, or it wasn't going to survive. And he did everything he could to shape the public mind in the directions that he thought was good public policy. You ask, what does Hamilton is he not able to bring to the table for our current times, to meet the challenges of our current times? And I don't think we can look at Hamilton and conclude anything about what particular public policies he would support. I think he was too much rooted in the context of his own time and its problems to be able to pull his policy positions out of that moment, put them into our moment, and try to make them work. I don't think that's how he thought about political life. He addressed the challenges of his time as best he could. So yes, he supported bounties for manufacturers, for nascent manufacturing in the country to build up the manufacturing base. Why? Well, first of all, he just thought it was good for people to have more alternatives to throw their talents into than an agricultural economy allows. It would provide for the production of war materials and national defense, so we wouldn't be reliant on foreign governments and perhaps adversaries to provide us with the needs of keeping ourselves independent. I think it's easy to forget, if you're not rooted in reading in that period, how fragile they all regarded the Republic to be, how constantly they worried about foreign invasion, whether it's from France, Spain, Great Britain. That was so much a part of the times that the notion of being able to arm ourselves, was quite popular, and that was Hamilton's notion. But again, I don't think, our times are different. We hear some of the same arguments for, building up our manufacturing base. And so there's some relationship or some commonality in the arguments of today and those of his own time, but I don't think it's a perfect fit. It does have to, I mean, if you try to think of the biggest difference between Hamilton and, say, the politics of our time, our politics are much more democratic. Hamilton was not a populist. He cared about public opinion. He, unlike Jefferson or Madison, actually would go out and politic, argue for and against public candidates for public office. That's one of the reasons Burr hated him, because he opposed Burr for the governorship in 1804. So, he was willing to do that. And so it's not that he didn't care about public opinion, but he wasn't a populist in the sense today, I think, that we think about it, that public opinion in its raw form should drive public policy. That's not Hamilton. The deliberate sense of the community, yes, but that's not what you get initially. It's got to work its way through the political process, competing interests and everything else before it becomes policy. And that's what leads to political moderation. That's what we're missing today, I think.
I like the mention of that virtue only for courageous minds.
I thought of you as I said it.
So I'd like to invite three participants to ask a question next, and then take notes and feel free to respond as you think fit, because we need to maximize the time. So it's Professor Viano, Professor Kolev, and Professor Lenkowski. Please feel free to unmute yourself. Professor Viano.
Okay. So thank you, Professor Wilson, for a wonderful presentation. And thank you for letting Hamilton speak. I love the quotations you had for us today. And I was particularly attracted by one where Hamilton mentioned respect and dignity, if I'm not getting it wrong, which made me think of John Adams and his protests regarding the accommodation of American ministers in Europe, and his insistence on the importance of dignified houses and places to meet other ministers or politicians. And I also thought of something else. I thought of Trump's expectations for federal buildings to be built according to neoclassical standards. I'm thinking in general of the current insistence on the idea of national dignity. So my question, I think, is about, it's historical, and it's about the role of respect and dignity, if any, within Hamilton's theory or ideas. And then, of course, if you think there is any connection or what Hamilton would have said about Trump's expectations.
Yeah.
Thank you, Professor Viano. I forgot to mention at the beginning, Professor Viano will be our next speaker a week from today with a wonderful talk about the meaning of the Statue of Liberty. Stefan?
Yeah, thank you, Brad. I learned a lot. I would like to use your expertise to understand better what's happening in Europe right now. So Hamilton's name is pretty huge in Germany currently because the German Minister of Finance in May, a social democrat, said he's super happy that the European Union is currently having its Hamiltonian moment. Basically meaning that the European Union for the first time ever could raise debt itself. And so the Hamiltonian moment should mean that basically we now get a spiral where national debt can be collectivized on the level of the European Union, as allegedly Hamilton did. So German political economists are now discussing back and forth whether that centralization or collectivization of debt on the European level might resemble what happened during Hamilton's time. So my question to you is, just very briefly, as I mentioned, do you think that Hamiltonian moment as a term, as a concept, could be applicable to what is happening in Europe now in the Corona crisis, basically using the crisis in order to get that European level being able to raise debt? And if so, what is your prediction, right? So the ordo liberal in me, who likes subsidiarity, accountability, and things like that, is very skeptical that such collectivization on the European level would be good for the European project. Thank you.
Thank you, Stefan. Les?
Yes, Brad, I really enjoyed your effort to talk about Hamilton as he was seen by later leaders such as the Roosevelts, but I wanted to push you a bit into more current times, as desirable as it might be for contemporaries and students especially to have worked their way into Hamilton's own works. I think it's fair to say that Hamilton's ideas will mostly be understood today and in the future through the prism of the Broadway musical Hamilton. So what I'd like to invite you to do is cast your political philosopher's eye on the musical and tell us, as a critic might, who's informed by having read Hamilton's own works, whether the impression of what Hamilton stood for as conveyed in the musical is a worthwhile and accurate one.
Okay, Brad, I think you have enough on your plate to try to address some of these issues, all of them. Yeah,
I'll do my best.
with moderation.
You know, having read 32 volumes of Hamilton's writings, I don't think he ever, other than with respect to commenting on his wife or women, casts an aesthetic eye on anything. It seems to have been foreign to, you know, Jefferson was very learned in architecture and was a bit of an architect himself. And Hamilton never seemed to say a word about any of that. It wasn't in his orbit of interests. So I don't know what he would think about I love the proposal to build neoclassical buildings, but I don't know what Hamilton would have thought about it. The respect that he is talking about should include an architectural element for sure. And of course, Washington, D.C. was built on a neoclassical model. So I think there was broad agreement that the country needed to have those kinds of institutions as a part of making itself respectable, or letting its dignity as an independent nation shine forth through its architecture. So I think, you know, whatever Hamilton might have thought, I think that a generation of leaders saw it that way. The respect that Hamilton is usually concerned about is the respect that the country needs to be able to borrow money from other countries. That's what he means by public credit. Other countries have to respect you, and they have to they have to recognize your integrity as a debtor nation, that you're actually going to pay them back. And so a lot of his thought about dignity and respect is about that, wanting foreign countries to look at the United States and say, you know, that is a sovereign nation that we can trust to be in relations with, which it wasn't such a place under the first Constitution, the Articles of Confederation. Nobody wanted to lend that country any money because they didn't think it could be paid back. The currency was being inflated so quickly, or deflated. So the question of the EU, what was the name of the Federal Reserve chairman under George W. Bush? Former Princeton faculty member, I should remember.
And Bernanke.
Bernanke, yes.
Bernanke.
So Bernanke was reported as having given copies of Ron Chernow's biography of Hamilton to EU leaders. So that, you know, he had something like what you're talking about in mind, that he thought that Hamilton's thoughts about economic integration could be applied to the European situation. I don't know whether, you know, I don't know enough about Europe to be sure what Hamilton would have to say about it. I don't think that Hamilton would think economic integration without political integration would be a successful enterprise. You know, countries have different interests. It's fundamental to Hamilton's thought. And each country has to be dealt with on its own terms, in terms of its own interests, including the United States, you know. So I think you'd have to figure out a way of consolidating the EU politically if you wanted a successful economic integration, but that's only an intuition on my part, not a product of anything I know in particular. The impression of the Hamiltonian, the Hamilton musical, which I admit to having seen twice, once with my wife and once with my students. Well, okay, so this isn't my political philosophy interest shining through here. This is just the things I thought went wrong, if I'm going to be the critic that you suggested I be. First of all, who the heck was Hercules Mulligan or something like that? That guy doesn't show up in the Hamilton writings. Mulligan wrote a few things about Hamilton, so he knew him, but he wasn't in any way in the inner circle of Hamilton's life. So, and they make a big deal about Hercules Mulligan. That's just fabrication. Aaron Burr, it's like Burr and he knew each other well and were buddies from the get-go. You know, that's just not the way it worked. It's true they were both practicing attorneys in New York City. They had to do cases together. They occasionally socialized together, but they weren't that friendly. As Hamilton says, he got on well with Burr. So that much is true, but they weren't friends. And I thought the musical made them seem more friendly than they actually ever were. They were never political allies, for example. You know, there's a line there where Hamilton in the musical says something like, "Immigrants get it done." You know, I mean, that's not a Hamiltonian thought. He never spoke, I mean, he was in favor of immigration if immigration was going to bring the kind of workers to America it needed to make itself more prosperous and to populate an unpopulated country. But then he was against immigration when Jefferson took office, because he thought that Jefferson was going to flood the country with people from other cultures, with different languages, and that it was going to be very hard to hold things together, which was always Hamilton's big question. How do we hold this thing together? So I wouldn't, you know, you just can't say that he was gung-ho on immigration. He was for certain reasons at certain times and not at other times. They might have made a little too much of his, they almost made him out to be an abolitionist, which he was not an abolitionist. He was for manumission in New York City, he was one of the founders of the New York Society for Manumission. And he was that for his entire life. He was involved with that, John Jay and he. But he wasn't a Garrisonian abolitionist. That comes later in American history. So I think a little too much was made of his anti-slavery views. I mean, he was anti-slavery. He himself did not hold slaves. One thing he does do, I don't remember if this is in the musical, is his best friend was a fellow named Lawrence, John Lawrence, from South Carolina. They were part of Washington's so-called family, the bunch of officers surrounding Washington during the war, young men. And Lawrence and he cooked up the idea to send Lawrence during the war down to South Carolina to talk to South Carolina politicians to see if he could persuade them to allow the slaves in South Carolina to be recruited for the Continental Army and earn their freedom by serving in the Army. Great idea. And he basically got he went down there and got the back of the hand from the politicians. But Hamilton, in talking about that plan in one of his letters, might have been a letter to Lawrence, says that it's good policy and it's also in accord with the rights of humanity. So, you know, he clearly thought that slavery was an injustice of a first order, and God knows what he actually saw in the Indies as a young child and adolescent on an island where the slave trade came through. And he was working for a trading house. He probably saw some really, really horrific things in the treatment of Africans coming through the Indies. So those are some of the things that bothered me. I guess the last thing that really bothered me less is that they make him out to be a bit of a cad or an alley cat or something when it comes to romance. And that's just wrong. I mean, he was guilty of adultery in his life. One time with one woman, well, many times with one woman over the course of a year. But it's not like this was a habit of his throughout his life. It wasn't. There's no other evidence of his ever even having a serious flirtation with a woman other than Maria Reynolds. And that he actually compares pretty well to Jefferson, you know, who actually got into some real controversies over his womanizing. So anyway, I just thought that was unfair. They used a myth about Martha Washington naming their cat after him or something because of his prowling around at night or something. That's just a myth put out by his enemies much later.
So you didn't like the musical. That's pretty clear.
Yeah. Then there's the music. So,
okay.
I could do without the rapped part of it, but I like Broadway musicals, so the more traditional songs are fine.
I'd like to go to the second round. We have a series of questions from Kwang Yu and Noah Eberschmidt. Kwang Yu.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Professor. And I'm interested in how you characterized a Hamiltonian version of nationalism, which means, as in your words, which means a love of the nation as a political whole. I'm interested in that because I see myself, I see a nuance between Hamilton and Tocqueville, because Tocqueville observed in America that the Americans' pride of their country, love of their country comes more from political decentralization than political centralization, which means that American citizens are more attached to their local political communities, where they could more actively exercise their rights, and where they more feel as a member of the political community. So I'm wondering, I'm wondering whether you also see that kind of difference, and I'm wondering like, what's the mechanism of the love for our country in Hamilton's account? Like,
Good.
is about love of a
Good.
strong political leadership? I don't think so. It's a love. It's a pride for the national power, or it's a more like Tocqueville, pride of being a citizen.
Thank you, Kwangyu. Professor Schmidt, Herbert Schmidt.
Yes. So I'm interested to hear your thoughts on whether or not this sort of renewed interest that there is in Hamilton, obviously because of the musical, but more in a sort of scholarly sense, whether or not this renewed interest, if you see it extending to different but allied strands of political thought in the Federalist Party of the period. And I'm thinking here most notably of figures like Fisher Ames or Noah Webster, who, while they do have sort of differences with Hamilton and his thought, particularly Webster, who tried to pick a fight with him to claim some credit later in his life, offer kind of nuanced approaches to something that supports Hamilton's line, is particularly in terms of national security and finance.
Okay, Brad, since there's no third question, I have a third one, but why don't you go ahead and answer the question?
Okay, so the question of patriotism or love of country. Hamilton recognized that the local political community is going to have a stronger pull on the affections than the national community. Just to give you one quote from Hamilton, "The human affections, like the solar heat, lose their intensity as they depart from the center and become languid in proportion to the expansion of the circle on which they act." He mentions the safety of a republic depends on that love of country, which will almost invariably be found to be closely connected with birth, education, and family, which are local matters. And then he does say, as citizens by birth or choice of a common country, that country has a right to concentrate your affections. So he did give some thought to this question of love of country. And he recognized its strength in the local areas compared to the national, which he thought was a problem, by the way. I mean, this was his fear that the centrifugal forces at work in the country were going to split it apart because people were more loyal to their states than they were to the nation as a whole. And so his political project was to somehow counterbalance that natural affection and figure out a way to attach it to the nation as a whole, or at least the national government is representative of the nation as a whole. And what is his solution? It may sound silly. Good administration. He just thought if you can make the national government better administered than the terribly administered state governments with which everybody was familiar from the revolution forward, people's affections would start to drift away from their state governments towards the national government. And if they recognized it as simply being superior in its manner of conducting itself and tending to the interests of the citizenry than the state governments, right? So that's his project. I think we've probably exhausted that project by now. I mean, we have a massive national government that nobody has any trust in. So this is not, there's got to be a point in which, the administration to be loved has to be good. It can't just be there doing something. So that's Hamilton putting on his cap as an administrator himself and thinking, how do I attach people to the national government, which is what's going to hold the nation together? And that's where a lot of his thinking in his financial plans is directed. The assumption of the state debts that had been accrued through the revolutionary period, having the national government assume those debts and pay them off was his way of preventing 13 different states having 13 different ways of paying off the debt, which he thought was divisive. One final point about that. Hamilton thought all the way through his political life that the threat to the national unity was going to come from the large states, in particular Virginia. He had a lot of experience with Virginians. He was surrounded with Virginians in the first Washington administration. You've got Madison and Jefferson and Washington himself. And he thought Virginia did consider itself a separate country. And he actually more than once recommended breaking Virginia up into smaller states so it wouldn't see itself as distinct from the rest of the country or superior to the rest of the country. So all the time, he's trying to figure out how to overcome the natural human bias in favor of the local over the national. Because he thought if the country broke up if it broke up, it would break up into separate confederacies, most likely, say 3 or 4 confederacies, which would then be vulnerable to influence from Great Britain, France, Spain, allying themselves with different foreign nations, thinking that's how they're going to secure themselves against the other confederacies. He doesn't think peace is a natural condition. It's a constant possibility. And nations have different interests. And so would the confederacies. And being side by side, it wouldn't matter that all 3 confederacies were Republican in nature. That's not what keeps things at peace. It's interests. So is there anything else I missed there? Is there something else? I feel like I might not have covered everything.
It's the second question by Noah.
Oh, yeah. Sorry, could you say a word about it again? Refresh my memory?
Yeah, no, I'd be happy to.
Thank you.
No, I'm just interested to see if you see this kind of resurgence or renewed interest in Hamilton's work, if you see it as actually extending to other sort of Federalists of the time. So
yeah.
I'm thinking specifically of people like Fisher Ames or Noah Webster, that sort of thing.
Yeah, no, that's great. I'd love to see that happen, by the way. Being interested in this period, I've done some reading in those other statesmen, and they're all worth studying. If I wish I had my dissertation to do over again, I'd go back and pick one of those people to write about, because they're fascinating. Thomas Pickering and people like that. Timothy Pickering, Thomas Pinckney, Charles Cotesworth Pinckney, Federalists all, and very interesting, and friends of Hamilton. So I'd love to see more of that. I'm going to, in my own series that Carson Holloway and I are editing, we've already almost persuaded a scholar of John Jay's thought to do at least 1 volume, if not 2, of John Jay's political writings. And I'd like to do that with others as well. It's surprising, there are collections of papers of these different statesmen. They just don't get read much. They're out there for anybody who wants to pick them up. And I think you could learn a lot. Henry Cabot Lodge has a book on George Cabot, one of the Federalists. It's well worth reading, my goodness. He had access, because George Cabot was his grandfather or something like that. He had access, or his grandfather-in-law. He had access to all that material, and wrote a very great book, repeating a lot of the original thought of Cabot. And you get a better sense. One of the things you get out of that is a better sense of how these Federalists, how they actually held it together, communicated with one another, worked out their views, sometimes differing views on policy questions. It's really, and who their common enemies are. That's always present too. So You know, Hamilton was one of the very few Federalists who supported the acquisition of the Louisiana Territory. The Federalists generally opposed that, but he broke with them and wrote publicly in favor of the acquisition. Now, he also insisted on saying that Jefferson just lucked into it. He didn't want to give him any credit for it, but he did think it was a good thing. Other things they differed about, the split with John Adams and the rest of the Federalists. Well, I mean, in a way, Adams was right, but he conducted himself so poorly that he alienated all of the important Federalist leaders, including Hamilton. It was over the quasi-war with France in the 1790s and trying to keep us out of the war. And John Adams just wasn't much for consulting with his advisors. he didn't have that gene. So, and his advisors tended to be close associates of Alexander Hamilton, who John Adams despised. And so he didn't want anything to do with his own cabinet and went ahead and made precipitous decisions about whether to negotiate with France and what to negotiate and who to send to France to negotiate, all that stuff without consulting anybody. And it drove his Federalist friends wild. And it's the main reason probably that he lost the political support he needed to make a real run of it in 1800.
Since our time is almost up, I just want to conclude our meeting by kind of on a nostalgic note, listening to Brad and all of these wonderful thinkers that graced our history. What a great honor and great privilege to have lived in that era. Thinking about that, those were big issues, divisive issues. Our country was at war almost against the parts of the country against each other, and yet to have lived in, think about it, to have lived in Philadelphia in the summer, the hot summer of 1787, to have been part of the debates in the ratification debates in the States in the 70s, 88, and all those kinds. So I think it's very important for younger generations of scholars, but also students to acquaint themselves with the treasures of this history. Those are not perfect individuals by any meaning, but listening to you, Brad, and listening to the comments, it seems to me that it's a matter of this, taking the best in our history and moving forward. And I think that for that matter, it's very important to rediscover what the idea of America was then and what it could be for us today. And in a week, we'll hear from Professor Viano about what the Statue of Liberty meant a century later. Professor Viano will be speaking about her book, The Sentinel, which was published by Harvard University Press a few years ago. And we invite all of you to join us next Friday. We hope that we'll still have a republic by then. The talk will be at noon Eastern time for anyone who wants to join us. Until then, I'd like to give a round of applause to both Brad and Matt for a wonderful job. Thank you to all.
Thank you. Francesca reminds us too that we have something else we can learn from them, which is the beauty of the English language.
Yeah, absolutely. And all of the quotations that you gave were a wonderful reminder of a certain dignity of style that is so much lost today. Thank you to all. Stay safe. Enjoy this beautiful fall day, and hopefully we'll see you next Friday at noon. Thank you, Brad.
Thank you, Aurelian. Thanks so much. Bye, everybody. Stefan, bye.
Thank you. Bye.
It's a great pleasure. See you next week, Francesca.
Thank you. See you next week. Bye.
And you have a beautiful library behind you.
Oh, thank you. Thank you.
Yeah.
Bye.
Wonderful. Ciao.